Hello and welcome to the program. On Wednesday, July the 4th, Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko signed a law on currency, allowing currency restrictions to be gradually lifted. But is Ukraine's market ready for such a change? What are the pros and the cons of this law? Joining us in our studio to expand on this topic is Mariya Repko, Deputy Executive Director of the Center for Economic Strategy. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, my first question, the document abolishes what I read, outdated regulations, sanctions for violations of currency legislation, currency control of transaction up to 150,000 hryvnias. So what does it concretely mean for businesses, for Ukrainian businesses and Ukraine market in general?
Yeah, Ukrainian businesses used to live under the post-Soviet framework of currency regulation. So they were prohibited to make any foreign currency transactions without the NBU's explicitly allowing it. And they had to gather thousands of documents, and it can weigh 3 kilos per one transaction, and this is actually not a joke. And Ukrainian business, of course, it could not develop in a way it could develop if the converting and transferring currency would be more easy as it was in Eastern Europe. For example, if we take such countries as Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, and so on, who are our competitors for foreign direct investments, even for the human capital. We see that in such countries, the converting and transferring currency is very easy. And you can easily export, you can easily import, you can easily buy or sell whatever you want. In Ukraine, the situation was the opposite. Besides Ukrainians, if Ukrainian company got some export proceeds, there was a surrender rule and you had to sell 50% and sometimes even up to 100% of your export proceeds. Of course, that's a disaster for a company who normally does business with the other countries, with the world. Yeah, and now it should be gradually lifted. After this law comes into force, National Bank promises that it will lift a restriction on this foreign currency surrender, and the rule of 180 days of making the foreign transaction, I mean the export or import transaction, should be concluded within 180 days. This should be lifted as well, because it was a huge disaster for companies when we talked to them.
Because it's a long process, because it's a really long now it's a long, before the law it was a long process, and it doesn't allow businesses to adapt quickly to a quick market.
Of course, even if you had a deal, for example, you were buying some equipment and this equipment takes long to build, to compose, and you can make the prepayment only 180 days ahead. So you can't make a 1 year prepayment or so on, and that was difficult. Now it will be much easier, we hope.
Now, was it part of the requirements of the EU-Ukraine association implementation? Because there are other requirements in this path toward Europeanization. This idea of fighting corruption, for example, and was it one of the priority of the government?
It was rather priority for the National Bank of Ukraine, and this law was drafted in cooperation very closely with EU officials and with the EU technical support team. It was great that we were having it in association agreement, because it's a huge step for Ukraine. And association agreement, besides the introducing free floating of capital, it abides Ukraine to make Ukrainian regulations corresponding with EU directives in different areas like lending, regulating foreign exchange market, regulating securities market, and so on and so forth.
Technicalities.
Yeah, so many more steps are ahead of us, and we hope we will see on 2019. We hope to see on the table the agenda on a free regime for financial services market with the European Union. This is stated in association agreement, and this is the target we have to go to.
Now, my next question would be about the Ukrainian market itself. Is it ready for such deregulation or such liberalization? Does it have the financial service for that? And also the hryvnia has been one of the most stable, in 2018, one of the most stable currency in the post-Soviet countries. How will it affect the currency and the course of the hryvnia? Will it affect the course of the hryvnia? And isn't there a risk of making it unstable again?
First, probably I will try to answer your first question on the market in Ukraine and is it ready. I think Ukrainian banks are not really ready for competing with European counterparties, but that would be great if this competition comes. They can develop. Without the competition, they won't. They will never develop, and they will be like providing business as usual while siphoning deposits from of households from the market and investing them in whatever their shareholders want. If they get European competition, they get better themselves. And Ukrainian citizens and companies, they get European standard services from European banks, European financial companies, from pension funds, insurance, and so on. Ukraine for Europeans is like a 40 million people market, heavily unbanked. We have like 50% of population using banking services, so that is huge. Less than 1% of population of people ever bought any security. So that's also huge. And I think that if we will have this free market regime in 2019, European companies and European financial advisories, they would be interested in Ukrainian market. And that will help to grow our local market as well.
And so as for the hryvnia, do you think it might resist to these foreign investors, and do you think it might resist this cash flow?
As for the hryvnia, there are clause in this law which allows the national bank to reintroduce or reimpose any restriction it wants. So if the real shock comes here, the national bank would be able to react. There is this mechanism. But what can I say? We have a floating exchange rate. We don't need fixed hryvnia anymore. Fixed hryvnia, it makes a huge gap in balance of payments. It makes Ukrainian goods less competitive in foreign markets. If you fix hryvnia, especially when don't having enough foreign currency reserves, that's bad policy. So nice policy will be to let hryvnia float. And with time passing, I think we will find equilibrium. However, I don't feel like this law will pose any significant risks because under the restrictions, many companies thought to like some shadow banking and shadow schemes, and many money are in offshore jurisdictions already. They are already there, so there's not so much money which can flow out of Ukraine.
Because, yeah, exactly. You raise actually the topic of my next question. Some might argue and some might interpret this law, and especially about this idea of the transaction up to 150,000 hryvnias, that it might open the door to certain laundering schemes. And
it's $5,000. It's $5,000. I don't believe in any like sizable schemes. While you will have to put it $5,000 at a time and even like daily. I believe there are many other ways if you want to go shadow. And this restriction, it will. This threshold of close to $5,000, it will allow small business to grow, to flourish. And for example, I work in a think tank, Center for Economic Strategy, and we tried to get the Economist subscription, the journal magazine Economist. We had to pay $12 to the Economist for this subscription. And our financial director, she spent like 3 days gathering all the necessary documents, gathering letters from the Economist that yes, we are subscribing for the Economist. So this stupid stuff will be let off.
So the idea is to get rid of a certain bureaucracy.
Yeah, of course.
And that's to conclude. You talked about this restriction and this possibility of a return mechanism in case of there's a problem, in case of there's a floating hryvnia. Are there other means to ensure it doesn't lead to way too much foreign investment and to wild capitalism as the country lived before? Are there other safety mechanism than just this mechanism of like we're gonna come back to fixed hryvnias?
I hope we will not get back to fixed hryvnia, and I think National Bank has all the instruments it could probably have in the world, because that's a very National Bank oriented law. It has a huge power, really huge. So I think if it will use it wisely, nothing bad can happen.
And also after this law, are there other steps towards the EU agreement or towards this liberalization? Is it the first step of another one, or is it?
That's the first step. Yeah, that's huge. That's like a frog leap.
So what's next?
The next will be several others, just making the Ukrainian regulations in securities market closer to European directives, and they are smaller than this. One of the major is the regulator on securities market powers. That's split law, which has to split the powers of one of commissions regulating the financial services market between the National Bank and between the State Securities Commission. So that will be probably the next big step. But there are many small.
Okay, well, thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today.
Thank you very much.
That was Mariya Repko, Deputy Executive Director at the Center for Economic Strategy, talking about the recent currency law. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.